what a gift that you'd have the kitchen staff do that. A couple of things maybe by way of background on myself. I have in the workplace been in the sales and marketing and leadership kind of space. I have been in the sales consulting business now for the better part of about 20 years, independently. In the ministry area, there's two passions I have. One is in the career networking space. I just have a heart for people who are out of work. I'm curious, and anybody in the room in transition right now? So we've got a couple of people. Incidentally, just to show you where my heart is, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us what kind of work you're looking for?
Required in June by Blackstone.
I know where this goes.
I'm in March. I will have to do the transition to Blackstone.
Okay.
So I've been in the real estate space since 1983. Worked for Morgan Stanley,
Okay. And tell us your full name again. Rand Worth. F-O-R-T-H. So let me do the second one. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
John Matthews. Company went public in August, and let's just say the tech did not go as planned. In October, November, they started a 10% layoff on the company. So, looking to do that, working with everything politics to media and running the team. Looking to stay in tech sales, but unfortunately, as y'all see in the news, Microsoft.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you, John. Thank you, Randy. Now here's the challenge to you. I just am going to abscond your entire meeting this morning. So I would challenge every man in this room. There's probably 50 men in the room. If we can't get these two guys reemployed in the next 60 days, shame on us. That's what the body of Christ is all about. And my guess is you guys have contacts in software sales and technology, in the property management, asset management. And if we band together and you guys seek these folks out this morning and help them to, again, you don't have to find them a job, just find them some contacts to allow them to meet some people, because that's how about 85% of the jobs are found is I know somebody who knows somebody who used to work at the company. Then to me, I don't know what the church is more than that. You with me? So John and Randy, you guys all have a task now. I'd actually love both of you to send me your resume, and I have contacts on both sides. In fact, I traded emails with the best sales recruiter in the city of Atlanta this morning. So I think we can help, don't you guys? Okay, perfect. By the way, you can send it to c3ghiring@gmail.com. c3ghiring@gmail.com. That's what we do every Monday morning for 20 years now up at North Point Community Church, which is where Devin and I go to church. We've been gathering a group of people who are in career transition. And the premise is that we're better together than any one of us is alone. I mean, it couldn't be a simpler kind of a mission. We had 45 people there yesterday. In 2009, we had 400 people in the room. We've got a couple of alums in the room who have been there, done that, and have been through transition. So if anybody, or somebody who could use a Christ-centered approach to networking, please have them come up to North Point at 8 o'clock on Monday mornings, and we will make them feel extraordinarily loved. All right. So that's enough on that. You heard a little bit about my family. We've got 7 going on 8 grandchildren. 4 of them, or almost 4, are in Japan. and they're moving back here in the next year and a half because my son-in-law is a pediatrician in the Navy, and we're excited about that. When you were driving here this morning, my guess is you're thinking to yourself, well, I'll bet this guy is probably a trained marriage counselor, or at least he's done some seminary studies, right? Because he must be able to share some insights. Well, I have really bad news for you. I got none of that. And all I am is a scarred, seasoned veteran of marriage, going on 42 years now, and married to Devaney. She and I both grew up in California. She was born and raised in the Baptist church. I was born and raised in the Catholic church. You can imagine how that worked initially. That's why 25 years ago, the light bulb came on for me, actually through a walk to Emmaus weekend, where it was obvious to me that Jesus was non-denominational. And so we decided to look for a church that we could all get excited about and the kids could learn to love Jesus. And that was transformational, one of the transformational moments in our journey. Another one happened, and the reason I'm up here and the reason I'm passionate about this topic of marriage is about 19 years ago, I was actually in a transition myself, and I had heard that North Point was looking for marriage mentors. So I went to Devaney and I said, well, I got an idea. Our marriage is better than most. We ought to help. And she was underwhelmed by that idea. And that was fascinating and demoralizing to me. And I, as I'm prone to do, when I get a gut punch like that, I really start to go down kind of the strategy side of things, because I needed to understand why I didn't get a more enthusiastic response. So she finally relented. I can be fairly persuasive. And so I go to one of the leaders of that ministry area at the church, and I said, Dave, we'd like to help. And he had the audacity to suggest that we go through a 13-week workshop to make sure that our marriage was reasonably healthy. And of course, I'm thinking, piece of cake, we got this. So we go through this thing called Intimate Encounters, and we get to about week 3, and it's a Thursday night, and there's 5 other couples in our group. And my wife, with tears in her eyes, says to the leader couple out loud, is it possible that our marriage could get worse in this process as opposed to better? Now, you guys are laughing, but yeah, I'm going to make you uncomfortable before we're done this morning. So what was happening is we were unpacking the first 23 years of our marriage. And I'm the workaholic type A, overzealous about my work, underinvested in a whole lot of things that were more important in God's economy. So she had a lot of disdain. We moved 6 times in 9 years. I was always off to the next job. She was packing up stuff and toting along the 3 girls and by the way, if I'm honest, I had an equal amount of disdain for her disdain. Anybody ever had the thought, you think I'm doing this for my health? You think I'm doing this for me? No, I'm doing this for you and for the girls and our future and all those things we tend to rationalize. Am I the only one guilty of that? Yeah, we'll call it rhetorical, right? You guys do not have to raise your hands yet. And it really kind of revealed to me the paradox of marriage, because I'll take honesty and vulnerability one step further. In a strange way, I get along with just about everybody I know in just about every environment. I don't struggle relationally. The one relationship I have been confounded by more than any in my entire life is with the woman I love more than anybody else in the world. Does anybody else share that kind of frustration? It's like, wait a minute, I've known her for 45 years. I love her more than anybody. I mean, we're naked together. We sleep together. But it can be the most frustrating relationship. And it's not related to her dysfunction. There's something in the nature of this relationship that can be absolutely confounding to men. And so I, in my type A kind of way, start this journey of discovery to figure out what in the world, Lord, am I missing? Why is this so hard for me? And am I the only one that this is hard for? And the ugly reality is, and maybe if misery loves company, no, I'm not. That marriage is hard for the average guy. And I've become, the funny thing is I'm embarrassed by the number of books I've read, both Christian books and secular books on the topic of marriage. I think of myself not as a creator of ideas. I'm kind of a curator on this topic of marriage. I don't have an original idea, but I think I'm getting smarter and smarter about where I was missing it and where the gaps are and what we don't understand that God is up to in our marriage. And maybe the way to say it is I'm fascinated by a few things related to marriage. And the reason I love getting up early for 50 men in a room who are crazy enough to get up to see this talk is I think there's, let me give you a few statistics. In 1970, 53 years ago, 72% of the adult population in the United States was married. Anybody know what that percentage is today? 49. Now just extrapolate that for another 53 years. Where will we be? Marriage is under fire right now. Number two factoid, the epidemic in marriage of divorce is what number of years married? Anybody have a guess? 25. Why do marriages end in divorce so commonly at 25 and 30 years? Emptiness, kids are gone. Our purpose together has now been compromised, and the house is really quiet, right? There's two of you. And you may not communicate all that much, except related to what I call transactional kinds of discussions. Here's the third one that maybe is more troubling to me than any. I'm maybe the best way to say it is the average marriage, and I'll put Christian marriages in the same category as non-Christian marriages. The average marriage is relatively mediocre. Now, my funny story about this related to Solely Business is I'm at Solely Business 15 years ago. There's a guy, I'm leading a group of men. They happen to be in the same Bible study small group. And I said to these guys, I tend to be provocative. I love making people uncomfortable. And I said to these guys, I'm guessing that most of your marriages are mediocre at best. And they look at me like I got three heads. It's like, well, who are you to tell me that, right? And it crickets, no reaction. So okay, well, we'll do fine anyway. So we go through the rest of the weekend. We have a great weekend, and that was it. And a year later, I'm back at the same weekend, late January, which is when I tend to go. And this guy, Steve, who was part of that group, sees me from across the cafeteria and runs over. And he says, we need to talk. And I said, okay, how about now? And he says, well, remember last year in that table group when you said our marriages were mediocre? He said, I was pissed. Am I allowed to say that at church? Pissed? I was mad. And I went home that Sunday night and I told my wife what you said. You know what she said? He's right. He's right. And now Steve's got tears in his eyes and he says, we sat down on the couch and we held hands and we said, we're not going to answer that the same way ever again. And that's what I mean. The ugly reality is when you ask women to rate their marriage, scale of 1 to 10, and you ask men and you ask women. In fact, let's do men first. You ask a man, rate your marriage, scale of 1 to 10, 10 being best. What do you think we say? 8 or 9? 8 or 9? What do you think the women say? 4. Same marriage. Not different marriages, same marriage. You see my point? Now, what that begs is, Andy, let's great, we're on the right one. So before you go forward, let me just say it this way. The one thing I'm convinced of that I was never convinced of before I dove deeply into this space, and I've been leading workshops of men twice a year for the last 12 years. We've had about 350 guys go through the program. We do it over 6 lunches on 6 consecutive Thursdays. And so I've got the benefit of a whole bunch of data points. And I never would have believed that you could simply have men in a marriage workshop. That seems completely backwards to me. Does it to you? Right? Because in order to fix a problem, you got to have the man and the woman in the room. And that's what counseling is premised on, and the intensive weekends and all those things. I stand here before you with a very different perspective 18 years later, because I'm convinced that a man, when you understand God's design for marriage, has the ability to transform your marriage starting with you. Even if she has far less interest in transforming that marriage. And I'll go to my death believing that, because I've seen the fruits of that many, many times. So let's go to the next one. So the reality is men are confounded by their marriages. I was telling Pat this morning, another Pat I know is a guy named Pat Morley, who leads a ministry called Man in the Mirror. It's probably the largest men's ministry in the world. And Pat and I have visited a couple of different times on a bunch of different topics. And he talks about men tend to respond to felt needs. And there's a short list of felt needs that men tend to have. And, career and parenting and, financial planning and how you manage your money, and marriage is one. And he says, if you had a scale and you put all the other felt needs that a man has on one side of this scale, and you put marriage on the other one, this one would drop down. Pat Morley's perspective is marriage is the most confounding thing. And these are the kinds of laments we have. Well, if you knew my wife, you'd understand why I struggle with my marriage. Why do you feel like, Peter, if you're only going to invite men to a workshop, is your premise that the man is the one who is at fault? And we'll get into that as we go. And the answer is no. But the good news is the way God designed us and our wives and marriage as an institution allows us to have the ability to transform our marriages starting with us. So now I don't know if I missed any. My guess is you're not brave enough to raise your hand and add to the list of common laments. But does that sound at all familiar, at least what goes on in your inner lawyer in your head? Okay, let's go. So I found this model. This is an example of my curation skills. I found this model and I modified it to my liking. There's 2 South African couples that travel the world talking about marriage. They're Christians, and they had this. They came up with this great model. They call it the red and green zones. I added the pink and blue zones. And here's the premise. At the origin, on the lower left, you have the selfish scale, right? She's on the, which one's, I always forget. Which one's the vertical? Thank you. That's our math major in there. So she's on the y-axis, and when she is selfish, right? And the guy is selfish, what zone are we operating in? The red zone. When we're both unselfish, where are we operating? In the green zone. How many marriages in the room operate in the green zone all the time? No, seriously, raise your hand if you're in the green zone, you liar, Pat. Right? Okay, now I'm not even going to ask you to raise your hand on the red zone. But the reality is, when you start digging under, why do men struggle so mightily on this topic of marriage? It's because you take two selfish, self-oriented people who come together and you expect them to immediately go to the green zone. And we don't. And we have different upbringings. We have different kind of norms. We have different expectations. In fact, Paul David Tripp wrote a marriage book he called "What Did You Expect?" Just dripping with sarcasm, right? Which is basically, when you take two people who are that generally self-oriented and you put them together, what are you going to get? You're going to get fireworks. And then you add kids, and then you add financial pressure, and then you add all these other things to the equation. It can get dicey. Let's keep going. So there's 6 basic principles that I'm going to share. By the way, you can, this is a really expensive book on Amazon. I think it's 99 cents on Kindle. It might be $2.99 for a hard copy version, or $3.99. They kind of control that. I've got it set on this where I don't get any money from the book. That's not my motivation. My motivation is I want to get to every man I can possibly get to who loves Jesus, and get them excited about what a God-centered marriage looks like compared to where they are today. So all these principles are covered in more depth in the book, and I'd invite you to go do it. I'd certainly invite you to join us for these workshops. But here's the principles. Number 1, real quickly, I'm going to rapid fire these. My study of the scripture says God is all about 2 major things for our lifetime. Anybody guess the first one? First and foremost, what does he want for us? He wants us to be his. What do we call that? What's the fancy word for you pastors in the room? Salvation, right? He wants us to choose to follow him. After we choose to follow him, I believe there's one more thing he wants for the balance of your life. And it's covered in, I'm up to 14 different verses that underline this notion. He wants us to be like his son, Jesus, by the day we die. What do we call that? Christ-likeness, right? 1 Thessalonians 4, what is it? Anybody? This is the will of God, right? To be like Christ. Now, go do your own study. I'm gonna share with you some verses in a minute. But if you start with that, then the next question becomes, what's the best way for any of us to have clarity on how we're doing on the path to Christ-likeness? My view was, can we use all of my work colleagues? Can we use all of my friends? Because it's obvious to me that I am very, very Christ-like with everybody else in the world except my dear wife. Now, what's the difference between the rest of you and my wife? What's the biggest difference in terms of how well you know me? You know this much, and she knows how much. She knows most of the rest, right? And that's there's good news and bad news. Principle number 2 says our marriage is designed as the full-length mirror to give us clarity, sometimes depressing clarity, about how we're doing in our path to Christ-likeness. Does that make sense? And of course, we would much rather have that full-length mirror be somebody who's doesn't know us so well and we're not so exposed by. But for me, I guess the reality of this journey and God's unbelievably strategic design for marriage is, what I didn't understand is that if our life after salvation is mostly about becoming more and more Christ-like, incidentally, what kind of words strike you as what Christ-likeness would be all about? Shout them out. Unselfish. Boy, it's early, but it's not that early. Kind. Take a punch, right? Loving, generous, long-suffering. Right? Are you starting to hear a theme here? Does it sound familiar? Something in Galatians, as I recall. Fruit of the Spirit, right? That's what we're called to be before we die. And the full-length mirror to give us that clarity. Bill Bright. Anybody remember the name Bill Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade? He had a strategy for interviewing his final candidates for executive roles. He would bring them in with their spouse, assuming it was a man. He would bring them in with their wives, and he'd spend an hour, and he would only speak with the spouse. And the point he would make afterwards is, I can tell the character of a man by the countenance of his spouse. My question to you is, if your next job depended on how well the countenance of your wife went in that final interview, would you get the job? Yikes. Yikes. Number 3, I said it before. Husbands have the ability to transform their marriage, starting with us. Now, most of you are not going to believe me. You're going to say, Peter, there takes 2 to tango. I mean, if you knew my wife, you know that this is not just my problem. I'm willing to confess that I have 10% of the issue. Okay, 15. But you have to trust me on this, or spend the time reading the book, that we men in this room can take a mediocre marriage and make it abundant. Number 4, here's the other part of the good news. You're thinking to yourself, if I go green, remember that model I showed a minute ago? If I go green, what's she going to do? Here's the evidence I have. God designed our wives to be unbelievably and profoundly impacted by our journey to Christ-likeness. Now, here's the fascinating thing about that model. Would you mind going back to the red and green zone? The reason I stole this model and changed it is, when a woman goes to the pink zone, when the woman says, doggone it, I'm going to be selfless. Guess what the man does? Celebrates. I'm in. This is great. Now, when that happens, what happens to the pink zone? Goes back to the red zone. When a man goes to the blue zone, what does the woman do? I'm going pink. Where do we end up? In the green zone. This is why I'm convinced, you want to use a small parallel. When a woman says, I'm taking the kids to church, what does the man say? I'll see you when you get back. When a man says, I'm going to take the kids to church, guess who shows up? The entire family. I think the same premise works in this. Now, again, you don't have to believe me, but if you go on a sustainable lifetime journey to Christ-likeness, I'll bet you a whole bunch of money that your wife will be profoundly impacted, because that's the way God designed her. Let's keep going. Let's go back to that slide. Number 5. Now this is going to be a little bit challenging and provocative to many in the room. This is one of the things I have ferocious debates with men about all the time. And that is, well, Peter, are you saying that I'm the problem? And the answer is emphatically no. But if you've ever struggled with what spiritual leadership looks like, you know, the Ephesians 5 and all the sermons you've ever heard about spiritual leadership, let me give you my translation to the simplest way to understand spiritual leadership in your marriage. You are not the problem. You are not the faulty one. But spiritual leadership, you are responsible for the health of your marriage. And if it's broken or if it's mediocre, then it doesn't mean you're the problem. It does mean, you know, the question, who is it? Gary Thomas gets asked all the time. When you're when you're in the middle of a spat and you're having a problem and you need to reconcile, who should do that? And what Thomas always says is, I think the more mature of you. I hate it when that happens, you know? It's like, dang. That's a Southern term, dang. You with me? So the question is, if you're in a Mexican stalemate about how we're going to fix this, and the reality is what a lot of us do is we become kind of resigned to the notion that this isn't going to get better, that we're going to peacefully coexist, or we're going to be roommates, or we're going to be something. And that's just not God's design for our marriages. He designed, right? He designed life to be abundant. He designed our marriages to be abundant. Let me tell you one other, I get on these sidelines. Devaney and I have been mentoring engaged couples for 15 years now. And every time in week 1, we have 8 weeks with each couple, we ask the same question. What is it from your parents' marriage that you'd most like to bring into your new marriage? Can you guess what the average answer is? The most common answer. We want to do it differently. So we think we've got our kids fooled, that they don't see us fighting. They don't see the gaps in our relationship. The reality is your kids are seeing it loud and clear, and they catch a whole lot more than they're taught in the scheme of things. And this is why when it comes to really transforming the marriage, most couples will kind of wait to see who makes the next move. I think what God's challenging us to say as men, as spiritual leaders, is it's my responsibility to make sure that we have as healthy and abundant a marriage as possible. And the last one is drawing closer to God will draw us closer to our wives. Would you show them the next model? In fact, yeah, perfect. Thank you. Here's the premise of the model I most love. Husband and wife at the bottom, God's at the top. Here's the premise of my argument. If you'll go vertical, men, towards God, and you believe the pink and red zone kind of the green and red zone concept, what happens to her? She goes vertical. What happens to those 2 boxes? They get closer together. You're the skeptic in you says, well, how do I know she'll change? There's only one thing we can control. What is it? Me. Literally, there's only one thing you can control, and that's me. Leave her in God's capable, sovereign hands. That's the cool part of this whole concept. That makes sense? Let's go back one. What does Christ-likeness mean? If Jesus is the aspiration, I went through all the Gospels and said, what are the attributes of Jesus? And you can see a laundry list there. I'm happy to make these slides available, by the way, if anybody wants them. Notice the fruit of the Spirit at the bottom: love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. Anybody batting 1,000 on that stuff? right now? Me either. It's literally, my hope is I'm going to become Christ-like on my last breath, on my deathbed. I think that's the journey we're on. And your marriage is the most strategic vehicle to help give you clarity on it. Let's go 2 forward. So one last thing, and then I'll do my best to answer a few questions and maybe have some fun, a ferocious debate among friends. I'm also a big believer in a concept called healthy mindsets. I wrote a book last year called 3 Truths and 7 Mindsets. We're not going to get into depth on that. My premise in the book is, if you took 100 Christian people and 100 non-Christian people, the hypothesis is there's not a discernible difference between these 200 people in terms of the degree that they feel a deep sense of joy and peace and purpose, which is a tragedy in my mind. Because if we believe what Jesus came and did for us and promised us, we should live an entirely different existence here on earth than any of our non-Christian friends. And I've always struggled with why that doesn't occur. Well, guess what? Our truths matter, right? Do you have basic truths that allow you to live in a way that embraces some healthy mindsets? What are examples of job search related mindsets for Randy and John? You know, here's a couple that I share all the time. You are going to get employed. It's not if, it's when. And now you've got 50 people on your teams. And if you don't get employed in the next 60 days, I'm coming back in 60 days and holding everybody else in this room accountable. Okay. Another one is I'm uniquely qualified to contribute. You know, the problem with job search is if the mind is a dangerous thing, how long does it take us to get fairly demoralized about our job prospects when you're in job transition? It's a matter of days or weeks, right? Usually. Same thing in marriage. There's a few kind of key mindsets that Devaney and I have learned to embrace that have been game changers for us. You know, let me take not all of them, but a couple of them. Assume the best of intentions as opposed to the worst. Anybody guilty of getting one of these relatively innocent questions coming your way from your spouse that don't feel very innocent? Right? I hear the chuckles in the room. A missile just got fired your way and you're thinking immediately, the defenses go up, the siren goes on, and you know you're under attack. And what is your wife thinking? Seriously, dude? It was an innocent question. Did you take the trash out? I wasn't trying to undermine you. I wasn't trying to accuse you. I just wanted to have you take the trash out. Am I the only one guilty of the inner lawyer kind of assuming the worst of intentions? Well, guess what? Embrace a new mindset. Second one, forgive quickly. My favorite definition of this is Paul David Tripp again. He says, the definition of spiritual maturity, this is going to be very demoralizing for most in the room. The definition of spiritual maturity is the amount of time it takes from the moment of offense where you somehow got your feelings hurt to the time it takes to reconcile. Okay. Now, for me, I was the powder. I could sulk. And the way I extracted a pound of flesh was not by overreacting or yelling or anything else. I would do the silent treatment, partially because I didn't want conflict and partially because I wanted fairness, right? And I wanted to make sure that she knew that she really hurt me. Well, guess what we've decided? We've wasted many, many days and weeks sometimes kind of not dealing with things and not forgiving. And our new game is, let's have a contest to see how fast we can forgive. I'll tell you, it is different when you consciously decide that. Why don't we do that, by the way? What prevents us, men, from forgiving quickly if you're honest. What a shock. Pride. No, I'm not wrong. Congratulations, you're not wrong. You guys haven't talked for a week. You haven't had sex for 4. Congratulations. Let's do one more. I got this one from Rick and Kay Warren. You know, the Saddleback folks. Rick Warren just I think retired, but he and Kay talk about this all the time. They are polar opposites. How many in the room, you and your spouse are mostly different as opposed to mostly the same? Okay, so it looks like about half and half. What they say is, because they're so incompatible, you can either be unhappily incompatible, or you can decide consciously that we're going to be happily incompatible. And that's Devaney and I. We're opposite in so many ways. I'm type A, she's type Z. Never met a list she ever liked, right? No planning, no strategy in her. It's like, live for today, right? And man, I wish I had 5% of her carpe diem, stuff. But I can either be frustrated by how different she is, or I can decide that we're just going to be happily incompatible. And just because she's different doesn't mean she's wrong. Anybody else have that self-righteousness in their mind? She's wrong on this. She's different. Well, congratulations. Your self-righteousness is winning, but it's damaging your relationship. You with me? Anyway, let's keep going. I think I've got one more, last one. Yeah, go one more. So some basic ahas. My point is, and I'll land at this and kind of tell you if you want to learn more, where you can get more information. I'll say it one more time. I'm convinced that the reason marriage is so hard is because it's so strategic in God's design. It's not because you're broken. It's not because your wife is broken. You are both unique. You're both different. You know, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. I get all that stuff. I do think there's enormous differences, but here's the reality. When you figure out that the journey you're on is about Christ-likeness, and that your dear bride is the absolute biggest gift that God has given you to give you clarity on your path to Christ-likeness, many times depressing clarity, and you start looking at her as a gift and as a jewel, as opposed to a frustrating, irritating, person who's giving me feedback inconsistent with what the rest of the world tells me, everything will change. You don't have to change her. Who will? God will change her. Leave her in God's hands. You focus on what you can control, and you'll find yourself in a transformed marriage. Last thing I'll say, the biggest question I get with men on this topic is, Peter, how long will it take? I'll answer it with Ken Nair. Ken Nair is the guy who probably transformed my mind more than any human. He's a pastor in Arizona. He's 86 years old. Nobody's ever heard of his book. It's called Discovering the Mind of a Woman. Now you're thinking, seriously? Must be a long book, right? Discovering the Mind of a Woman. It is a long book, but Ken Nair gets asked that question more than any. He always answers it the same way. Don't be impatient. How long did it take you to get here? Because if you're thinking that 30 years of hurt and scars and disdain are going to get solved because you're operating in the blue zone for 3 weeks and you can't believe that she's not going pink, this is a lifelong journey. Okay. Let's go to the last slide. What's an abundant marriage? I promised I'd give you my definition. Honest, transparent communications. Intimacy is common and fulfilling. I knew I'd get your attention on that one. relationship that's conducive to raising self-sufficient, faith-filled children. I am zealous on this, on the children front of this. I think our kids are getting a very, very tainted view of God's design for marriage. And if you want to give them the biggest gift you could possibly give them, make a huge investment in this relationship, where love is a verb, not just an emotion, and two spouses are growing in Christ, selflessly serving each other. Now, I don't know how you line up on that. I don't know if yours is great, good, mediocre, or on life support. If I can help in any way, this is what God's got me on by the collar on. This is just, I do it for fun because I've seen so many marriages transformed. And would love to have you join us at one of these workshops. By the way, I've got to make a change to that January 26th. I had planned to start Thursday. I'm going through some medical testing to figure out something that's going on in my crazy body. So I'm going to defer that for a couple of weeks. If you have the ability though to join us for 6 consecutive Thursdays at lunch, we literally start at 11:45 and finish by 1:15. So even people who are working can join us and get in and out. We do that up in the Alpharetta area. Just send me an email or go to a website and register on menyourmarriagematters.com. I've got a bunch of videos out there. There's no charge for any of this. This is just for fun. And the book is out there on Amazon, including audio for those of you who hate to read. So let's open it up. Questions, objections. The harder the question, the more I like it. Don't be bashful. And if you have to go to work or whatever.
If you've got a question, please let me know on this.
Challenge my assumptions.
And I'll start with here. How long did it take you once you went blue?
I still don't think I'm very blue. The evidence I've seen in my marriage, we went through 3 or 4 what I call rebuilding years. And I left corporate America. What I figured out is my overzealousness was fairly related to when a big corporation paid me a fair amount of money to do a reasonably good job. There's something in my heritage that says I've got to give the company an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. And I rationalize that a lot. When we went through this process, I left corporate America. I went independent. There's a guy named Rick Page who had a consulting firm here in town who offered me a whopping salary of $0 and said, I'd love for you to join me, but you're going to have to make everything you earn, earn it, if you will. And it changed everything for me because then I didn't have that excuse anymore. And so I got some balance in my life. We started investing in a big way. I would say 3 or 4 years later, it became obvious to me that the first 23 years, I didn't understand what marriage was all about. And about 2 years later, I started doing this ministry. So. Yes, sir.
What are some things you do? I know everybody has different love languages, and some of us understand that you do that to affirm your wife, good or bad, in good or bad terms.
I shared a couple. One is literally, it's so easy for my inner lawyer to basically be the judge and jury when she has some proclivity that's different than mine and I assess as being, lesser or wrong. I've literally learned to say in my mind, just because she's different doesn't mean she's wrong. Right? Or let's just be happily incompatible. So that's one. Here's a second one. And again, I hesitate to share some of these because it sounds like I'm trying to be prideful. In fact, I'll give this one credit to Sonny Newton. Any solely business guys know Sonny Newton? Sonny Newton was one of the key executives at Chick-fil-A for years and years. He led the supply chain area. And he shared a story with me a bunch of years ago and said, Peter, do you treat your wife better than your dog does? And here's what he meant by that. When my wife gets home, at the end, when she got home, when we had a dog, Bella, our dog, did what every single time the garage door goes up? Could be in the middle of a 3-hour nap, scurries to go to the back door, tail wagging, can't wait to greet her, so excited that she's home. What do? Oh, you, how long have you been back, honey? Right? And his point is, and so I adopted, when Sonny said that to me, I didn't actually do it that year, about 2 years later, I said, you know what, Bella's not gonna beat me anymore. And every time the garage door goes up, if I'm not on a Zoom call, I'll get up, physically go to the door, and the first thing we do is hug. Now. Yeah, initially, right? But now, if I don't do that, she's wondering, she assumes I'm on a call. But there's a little example of, in fact, let me share it this way. John, anybody read any of John Gottman's stuff?
Yeah, we used it for a study started the year in August.
Use it for old couples. John Gottman, this Gottman stuff, Gottman research, he and his wife both do this. Here's what they figured out about marriages. Marriages don't struggle because of big problems. They struggle because of tiny drip, 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 drip. And he says, early in a marriage, when you have an irritating thing about you, think back to before you were married. Your wife would have said, oh, that Peter, it's so cute when he leaves his underwear on the floor. And then you fast forward 5 years, and what does that cute thing turn into? Irritating. And then you go 15 years, and what does that irritating thing become? Contempt and disdain and literally hate. The Gottmans say what happens to marriages is we lose sight of the little transactions. He calls them bids. You know what a bid is? A bid is when your wife and you are on the couch, sharing couch. She says, do you have the clicker? And you say, yes. Now, the bid was she asking just out of curiosity if you had the clicker? No. She obviously does not like Monday Night Football, right? Now, you answered the question, but you lost on the bid. And he actually has a measure for what he calls master marriages and disaster marriages. And he says, for every bid that gets offered to a spouse, when it's answered in a positive way, honey, look at that bluebird. If I say I'm busy, that's -1. You miss the bid. If I say, oh, that is pretty, +1. Okay, master marriages, disaster marriages. The ratio of positive bids to negative bids in a master marriage is 5 to 1. Guess what it is for a disaster? Yes. You're thinking 1 to 5. It's 1 to 1. 1 to 1. You're thinking, well, half the time I respond well, right? You want to get really demoralized? This is a contest. Everybody go home today and count the number of times that you are dismissive to your wife in some form or fashion today. Just count the number of times she asked a question and you didn't answer, or you looked at her with a look like, seriously, you want me to do that or answer that? Just count the number. Every one of those is a minus. This is why marriages end up over 25, 30 years. Because it used to be cute And then basically what it turns into is he doesn't love me. But what are you talking about? I don't love you. Of course I love you. I've been with you 30 years, right? Go read Gottman's stuff. It's a game changer.
Got copies of the book from you.
Perfect. Thank you.
So I assume your children are married.
Two of them are.
How's that going?
Fantastic. Both have, are about to have 4 children. One in Japan with 4, one here in Laurel Springs with 4. My youngest daughter is about to go on a world trip. She's always been single. They all 3 love Jesus. My son-in-law, I guess I don't mind sharing this. What happens in Dunwoody United Methodist Church stays in the. My middle daughter is married to the gentleman I mentioned, and he struggled with porn for a long time. And I knew about it early. I've talked with him about it for years and years. It came roaring back a couple of years ago. So we had a bit of a crisis in all of that, but in a strange way, it's been transformational for him and for my daughter and for all of us. And thankfully, we have a really open discussion about it and dialogue. We had a scary couple of months through that because he had to respond in a way that was, if he hadn't, I'm not sure Katie would have stuck with him. But the end of the story is really, really good. And he's closer to Jesus than he's ever been. So pray for Scott in that regard. Okay.
And Peter, for those of us that are in the room here because we were interested about the topic or wanted to improve our marriages, but we probably all have some buddies who aren't in the room. So do you have any tips or anything on how to lovingly encourage them to either find a course like yours or something similar?
Yeah, I think it's funny that people struggle. A lot of times we struggle with sharing our faith, and most of us are not going to be great at putting a John 3:16 sandwich board and going out to the corner and saying, hey, do you know Jesus? And da, da, da. In a strange way, the topic of marriage is actually a really cool topic to engage your friends on. And most guys that go through the workshops that I've been a part of, one of their biggest observations is in 2015, whatever the number of years is, do you know that I can't talk to anybody about my marriage? There's nobody safe. Anybody ever been a part of a couple's small group? And you ever feel comfortable sharing chinks in the armor about your marriage in those small groups? I mean, what happens on the ride home when you do? That is one long ride. This is one of the things that the light bulb went on for me. Well, here's the opportunity. What men don't get is an opportunity to be with other men talking about marriage in a safe environment. So you'd be surprised. Make a marriage the topic for a study. If you need advice on what books would be good for that, there's lots of great books. I love the love languages, Gary Chapman. Gary Thomas has got some really good stuff. There's actually a new one Shanti Feldham came out with a couple of weeks ago related to sex and intimacy, research-based information. So you're thinking none of your friends want to engage on the topic of marriage. The reality is most of your friends are frustrated with their marriage, but it's not safe to talk to anybody. I think there's really good resources out there, either at your church, with my program, which by the way is not a formal part of North Point. They obviously recommend a bunch of people to mine, but I am completely independent from North Point on this, just because I wanted to be inviting to as many men in the North Fulton area as possible.
That's not a big deal. Andy was here last week and spoke.
Perfect.
So we're all in this together.
Amen.
What's really interesting is the images you're using of red and green zones. I had a sermon that I preached when I first got here that most of you didn't hear probably because you're out of our But I had planned to re-preach a version of it. We planned this 8 months ago, and it's on red and green zone. It's not this Sunday, it's the 5th. So if you need to hear more about this, and how to stay in the green zone, I have a sermon on the red and green zone that's coming up on the 5th of February based on the Corinthians, first Corinthians.
Excellent. I love it. I've never heard anybody preach on it, so I'm gonna check that out. Yes, sir.
How long did it take for your wife to become your best friend?
You know, it's interesting. I think she would have said that before me. We have a renewed marriage now. Here's the way I tend to say it. Because I think my frustration was bigger than hers. I used to frustrate the dickens out of me that everybody else in the world told me I was a really good guy, and my wife told me the truth. And so I had a tainted view of what the truth was. And once I reconciled that, I think that's when both of us came together. She always wondered why there was some kind of a wall. And the bottom line is, I would say, Debbie and I have been married 42 years, known each other for 45 years. She was an absolute knockout as an 18-year-old when I met her. I am so much more desirous of her physically, emotionally, spiritually today as a postmenopausal 63-year-old woman than I ever was as an 18-year-old knockout. And we just love being around each other now. And that's what I want for the 30-year, 40-year, 50-year marriage, is not can we peacefully coexist, but can we really enjoy every day? And that's what we're experiencing now. And I pray that you will too. But don't wait until you're 63 to get there. For I see young guys in the room with a lot less gray hair. About 1 or 2 more. Yes, sir.
So it's not as much of a challenge, but I think one of the things that I appreciated was you putting it in terms of being Christ-like. I feel like I've tried the unselfish, like to the extreme, with little results, but my wife and I are probably the opposite, where she's more type A.
Yep. Yep.
But over the last month, I've just personally made changes, whether it's for health or Bible study type things and stuff like that, and I've seen a little bit different. So in my mind, the red green zone is less about selfish, unselfish, but becoming more Christ-like. Open to your point, which is kind of the revelation I had this morning, that it's not about me trying to help her or do more for her. So it's about me.
And you are so right. And it's let me bring in one more concept. There's a concept I love. I call it the fairness doctrine. Everybody in this room has a fairness doctrine in your back pocket. And you're willing to be unselfish, or you're willing to be something, as long as what? As long as she does too. And there's a contingency in the fairness doctrine. I need you guys to literally tear up the fairness doctrine. Throw it away. Christ-likeness is not contingent. Did Jesus have a contingency clause in his sacrifice? It was all in. All in. So that's why I get asked the question, well, Peter, it's been 3 months and she hasn't responded. So what journey are you on? Because the guy who says that is on the journey that says, I'll do this as long as she responds. No, that's not the deal. The journey, the biblical journey is Christ likeness with what contingency built in? None.
Unconditional.
Unconditional, non-contingent love, sacrifice, dying to self. And I don't know if your wife will ever respond. Ken there says, maybe never, but that's not in your control. You are on a path to being like my son Jesus. Thank you.
I think the only thing I would add is I don't think it was as much I was trying to be radically unselfish, fair enough that, but I think what I've seen is, as I've become more disciplined in my own life, with my health, with different things like that, in my mind becoming more Christ-like, becoming more disciplined and stuff. That's what I'm seeking for response.
Yeah.
Being selfish.
Sure, I'm with you. I'm with you. One more? Can I pray us out? Okay, if you would. Thank you, Lord, for this time together this morning for this amazing breakfast. Lord, we all want to grow closer to you. Would you draw us to you, wrap your arms around us as men, as husbands, as fathers, and help us to recognize that it's a vertical journey. And then when we get serious about that journey and not have any contingencies, we give you our spouses for your glory. We love you. Pray this in Jesus' name.